Sure. So thanks, Patrick. Guess I'll dive in here. So my name is Roland Osborne. I am an entrepreneur in residence here, a three-time founder. My day-to-day really consists of working with the accelerator team here in San Francisco as a mentor alongside our investment team. And then I run PoC management with our corporate partners.
Hi, everyone. This is Jenny. I'm a manager on our team here, and I oversee our corporate startup engagement programs and partnerships. So that means anything from corporates trying to identify relevant startups to meet their business challenges and work with, all the way to setting up proof of concepts and some of the other activities they need to kind of activate innovation internally. Prior to 500, I worked in and out of many corporate innovation labs and venturing units, so very familiar with the challenges of getting internal initiatives through large, complex organizations.
Thanks, Jenny. This is Vijay Rajendran. I have responsibility for our corporate innovation and partnerships team here at 500 Startups, based in San Francisco, but work globally. As many of you know, 500 is a global organization. And we spend a lot of time helping companies that want to see, find, or invest in the startup landscape, and helping them to buy or invest or partner with startups, much of which you'll hear about today as we share our perspectives on what's happening with regard to the world of POCs and how to actually work with startups. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jenny.
Great. So before we get into the material, we were curious to get a sense of who's in this forum and what your roles are. So, Patrick, if you can pull up that poll, we'd love to see who we have on the line.
Absolutely. And on your screen, you should see a poll launch now.
Polling music.
So then we'll go maybe another 5-6 seconds. Ton of people in this webinar, fantastic. All right, 3, 2, 1. And I'm gonna go ahead and share the results with everyone, but the clear winner is Corporate Innovation Lab, Incubator, and Accelerator.
Okay, that's terrific. I think there is going to be some relevant content for everyone, regardless of where you sit in the organization and your role. But I think for those within innovation labs and incubators, as well as those who are entrepreneurs trying to advance innovation within your companies, I think you'll probably find the most value from some of the stories that we're going to share. And if you're also working in the investing space, you'll see some of the things to look out for and potential flags as you consider startups and other companies you may look to invest in. All right, so let's get into it. Before we get into some of our POC pitfalls and some of our principles and stories, wanted to refresh for some of those who may be less familiar with 500 Startups and why are we even kind of in this space and talking about the topic of POCs. So for those of you who are less familiar with our brand, our mission is to discover and back the world's most talented entrepreneurs, help them create successful companies at scale, and build thriving global ecosystems. So many of you may be familiar with our flagship accelerator program run out of San Francisco. And we do a number of boot camps and other programs all around the world, as well as venture programs for aspiring investors. But we also work with other players in the ecosystem who are looking to tap into startups and the tech world more broadly to activate their innovation. And this just gives you a glimpse of how global we are. We are in 70+ countries, and have over 2,000 portfolio companies, about 40% of which is international. So we're quite proud of how global we are and are always looking out for the next investors and startups in new and emerging economies. And this just gives you a snapshot of some of our current portfolio wins. I believe this number of unicorns has actually been up over the last week. And we also have what we call centaurs, which are basically unicorns in the making. And so, as I mentioned, apart from investing in startups, we do a number of other activities and consider ourselves an open innovation platform for anyone who wants to tap into that startup ecosystem. And so that means that we have investor training and a number of programs that are designed to work with startups and have companies and other nonprofits and governments around the world figure out how to use the next generation of founders and entrepreneurs to activate their own internal innovation ecosystems. And, us, as well as many others who are adhere to this idea of open innovation, really see the value in startup engagement. So, startups can provide everything from talent to business model inspiration to actual technology for these corporations. And corporations can offer everything from a testing environment to a customer base for distribution and scaling, and of course, capital, although that's something that I think startups, especially some of the high potential ones who are actively raising funding, they often have a lot of options for capital. So that's not often, the first thing that comes to mind in these partnerships. And our job often is to figure out what's the best way to engage startups. And so pilots and POCs are a crucial step of that journey, where the startup has gotten some traction already, potentially with an initial customer base or in an initial market, and they're really looking to grow that. And a corporate can be a fantastic way for them to scale up. And so, POCs and pilots are one big step of the journey. And for an outside investor as well, something that you may look to and try to figure out, how much traction does this startup have? Have they gotten enough proof points to give us the confidence in their ability to really grow and tap into the market that they're trying to address? So it's probably a good idea to start with, what is a proof of concept? The definition definitely varies of where you sit in the ecosystem, and even with the partners that we engage with, there's a lot of confusion as to, how you define this and what success looks like. So these four parts of the spectrum is probably what we see most of our partners define commonly as they think about, POC versus a pilot versus full production. And that tends to be one axis is the amount of time it takes to mobilize these things. And the other axis being how big of the scope are we addressing and how contained is this project? But for 500 startups, the way we think about a POC is that they are experiments to validate the fundamental claims that a technology makes. So it's all about testing the technology and whether it works. Whereas a pilot then is a way to test whether those claims hold up in a much broader context. And so maybe you put it in a more complex environment or in the hands of sample customers.
Right, and thank you so much, Jenny. So this is Roland here. It's really, really easy to get lost in these definitions. And if you look around, as Jenny mentioned, you're going to see a lot of different ways that people kind of make subtle differences between POCs and pilots, prototypes, MVPs, all of those things. I think the key point to remember here is that this whole exercise is one of de-risking. It's of taking kind of the smallest possible testing unit that you can to learn something. And no matter how you slice or dice it, like reminding yourself that this is a learning exercise is really the key the key takeaway. Yeah, so, and I mean, it's even possible to take a single POC and break it into multiple stage gates in service of that kind of de-risking process. All right, so the reason you're all here, 3 ways to fail before you've even started a POC. So I wish I could say that this list we're about to give you is exhaustive. It's really just a small piece of a small sampling of the ways that a POC can go wrong, and even a small piece of, you know, looking at this from the investor side, even just a small piece of some of the things you should be aware of when you're interacting with companies that do have engagements with corporates in the form of a POC. So we're going to be going into this stuff much more in depth at VCU, but I hope that this kind of serves as, you know, a nice overview of some of the types of things you might want to watch out for when you are a corporate engaging with companies in the form of a POC, or an investor who's kind of looking from, you know, a higher level view of companies that are engaged in POCs. So I'm going to touch on some examples that I've either worked with directly or in our network, where I've got kind of firsthand knowledge of some things that have gone wrong. So names have been withheld to protect the innocent, or perhaps the guilty. All right. So the first thing to be aware of here, really, and this seems like something that is completely obvious or easy to do, but not identifying the right problem to address in your POC is really the first place that people tend to go wrong. If you don't choose the right problem to address, you're going to end up testing too many things, perhaps blowing up the scope as that our slide showed before, or just wasting time and resources. Even worse, you might not even learn what you set out to learn, so you can go through this whole process and think that you've done a great job, but you haven't even really learned anything at the end. It's a waste of both corporate time and time of the startups you're engaging with. So some examples of where, you know, we've heard of this going wrong. There was a blockchain company that kind of came into a POC claiming it could validate transactions more quickly and at scale. So it's probably a nice, easy thing to validate. Unfortunately, as other stakeholders became involved in this POC, there was a desire to make it a flashy thing for management, for showing off a kind of futuristic example of what could be done with this technology, even though there weren't actual commercial stakeholders at the table. So the scope of this project really ballooned. And it turns out that to do that kind of futuristic, and this was an energy trading example, it was going to require access to a bunch of corporate data. And for all of you in corporates, you know that anytime real data is used, it opens up a whole can of worms in terms of, you know, legal requirements, simply the time it takes to get people to sign off on things. It's a really quick way to roadblock a POC. Again, this all stemmed really just from people expanding the scope and trying to ask too many, get the answer to too many problems. So resist the temptation to ask too much of your POC. You can always ask more, do follow-ons, do a pilot, do another POC to answer those other questions. Again, the idea here is to de-risk, break things into small chunks. So another example is a predictive analytics company who was working to very tight engineering specifications around false positives. And so the initial claim, there actually was a successful initial POC that kind of proved the initial claims, but ran into a roadblock because those really tight specifications, which did have good intentions behind them. It was you know, they were designed that way to help customer experience. You know, around 99.999% accuracy and making sure people didn't have false positives. The problem here was that instead of reframing a kind of a second question around, you know, can this technology be 99.99% accurate? Could we reframe this problem as how do we deliver value to our customers? And so essentially this project was stopped where there was a whole sea of opportunity to explore in creative, innovative solutions for handling some of these cases where perhaps there were false positives. And what ended up happening is this company was ultimately working with other partners who were willing to reframe that problem. So in not doing this, you can really lose out completely, even if, you know, an initial test goes well. So it's always, while you might have really good reasons behind your assumptions, when you're working with startups, you really want to, this is your chance to question them. Many times breakout innovations come from rethinking the game, and you are engaging with startups because they're not necessarily playing by the same rules. So you don't want to push them away without reflecting on whether you're really asking the right problem. All right, number 2, downplaying the reality of resources. This one might be somewhat obvious, but it's something that you really need to think to plan ahead for. So the obvious things here are, you know, making sure you've got stakeholders aligned, that kind of aligned behind your problem statement. Making sure you've got management buy-in so those people can actually spend the right amount of time interacting with the POC, and kind of beyond just management buy-in. Just saying, hey, this POC is important is not enough. You got to realize that everyone's time is finite. Like there's going to have to be something that is taken off the plate of these stakeholders to actually get things done. So I think quite frequently management can quote unquote have buy-in, but isn't like giving those people space to maneuver by taking other things off the plate. Making sure you've got time budget for legal and data. It's always going to be slow. If you've scoped the problem right at the beginning, you can perhaps avoid some of these things, but if it's unavoidable, if that's core to the problem you're asking, you really got to think ahead. Ideally start to structure a process in your organization so you can fast track some of these things around legal and data. And another thing, you know, if you're dealing with hardware products, you know, coordinating facilities and test equipment well in advance is also something you gotta think about. I guess just to flip this, and I'll give an example. I think that corporates often forget about the resources on the other side, on the startup side. And it's almost more pertinent, that can kill things almost faster than your internal resources. I've seen startups that are so desperate for revenue basically pull back from POCs and end things because they have to chase the revenue, right? They're operating on this extremely condensed timeline. And that means that as a corporate, you either need to move faster or you need to be prepared with budget to basically buy yourself time, right? To pay for a longer POC to keep the startup engaged, because otherwise you're going to lose them. And I think that this is often not really seen, or even kind of, I think startups don't tend to even talk about this until it's too late, because they want to present well to the corporate. So this is kind of a hidden thing to be aware of. It's important to understand, what the startup is getting along the way. All right, and here's number 3, overlooking the power of pride. This one is also kind of tricky and overlooked, and can truly derail things before they've even begun. Now, we're all human, and as such, we're imperfect, we're jealous, we're insecure, we're proud. These are forces that can really serve to sabotage a POC from the inside out. It's important to be aware that people interacting with or evaluating companies might be threatened if the project succeeds, right? It might replace a division, might, affect someone's job. These are real forces that might get in the way of your POC. It might block you from interfacing with the stakeholders you really should be interfacing with, if they're threatened by the project. Sometimes it's as simple as a startup making someone look bad. If they've built their career around a particular viewpoint, they might be tempted to kind of make the startup sound stupid, especially if this is happening in front of their peers or others. This stuff can get pretty ugly. And they might behave badly in front of the startup. They might just feel, that, hey, I'm the expert. I'm used to being the expert in this corporate. I'm going to make sure that this startup knows I'm an authority figure, and it's kind of talking down to the startup. It's also something that happens way too common. And I've seen this basically make startups run the other way. So during startup sourcing calls for a security product, there was a corporate expert on the call that was really on a mission to show how capable they were and how much they knew about the space, and how they knew way more than the startup. And the startup happened to be very highly qualified. After this call, chose to walk away because they were offended, didn't want to work with this corporate. And this is something that needs to be really highly managed as you bring in people around the org to interface with the startup. It happens all too often, and can truly just stop things before they've even begun. All right.
So that concludes the teaser of 3 ways to fail before you've even kicked off your POC. And I think Roland and our broader team have seen many other examples, but I think some of which we'll cover a little bit in the course, the actual course in New York, but others of which we'll cover in likely future content. But we'd love to open it up for more questions from the audience. And I know we have a couple already that have come in that we can kick off with.
Yeah, absolutely. So remember at the bottom of your screen to use the Q&A function when you're sending us questions. And again, this could be anything regarding the POC. And just want to kick it off by first saying that this group of attendees is incredibly international. We got folks from all over the world, Latin America, Europe, and it's super exciting to see. So welcome. And just to dive into the Q&A for the first question from Andrea Diaz, who should lead and overview the execution of the POC pilot in partnership? The innovation area as well, the area the partnership will engage with, the corporate strategy area. So who should lead and execute?
Thanks, Patrick. This is Vijay, and to echo what Jenny and Roland have said, it's great to be able to just have these 500 office hours with folks who are on the front lines of innovation. So bring us your real world situations, and we can like spend time focusing on that. To the first question, like who should be leading? It's important that somebody like lead the charge, and that's going to generally be the innovation area. Every company is a little bit different, and there can be nuances, of course. So it's not a universal rule, but the innovation area is going to be that glue and can serve the important role of translator between startups and the business units, at least in the initial phase, to determine whether there's something worth exploring here. And then once the interests are aligned and expectations are clear, requirements can be defined, things like that, then there's enough momentum that hopefully business units will see the potential. They'll start to see quick wins, and you can give them the tools and processes to perhaps run more independently. That is the sort of ideal trajectory that we'd advise, so that long-term innovation is too important for just the innovation team to take on. But no matter where you sit, you need someone to kind of kick things off and help build that momentum.
Yeah, I would add, I think the innovation area or team should be leading the charge and kind of translating between the startup and what they're looking for from that corporate. And ideally that team and the personnel in it have visibility into kind of the web of stakeholders within the corporate that may be affected or interested or have some stake in whatever is going to be piloted or tested through the proof of concept. And so it's important to have people who understand the broader corporate landscape and are able to tap into the right people at the right times. This will definitely depend on the makeup of your organization and just the bandwidth of your staff too. But we see for sure the most successful partnerships are when there are people who are able to kind of translate between those two worlds.
All right, so we got a question here about examples of hardware, biotech, deep tech, or non-digital POCs and how to handle those. An example of how do we handle POCs that are potentially on a longer time horizon. And the thing here is that some things are going to just take more time. A lot of the success here comes down to making sure that you've properly set expectations towards what the POC can really do. Another trick here is to break things into smaller chunks, right? You might be trying to prove too much at once, and so it feels like the progress is slow. Really what you need to be doing is, looking at kind of a core piece of tech, a smaller piece, so you can go back to management and stakeholders and show that something is moving, or decide that, hey, this is not going to work, and move on. You always need to be able to kind of cut your losses if things aren't going the right way. I guess I might add that if you're expecting hardware, biotech to move quickly, or you need it to move quickly, you should not be looking at the earliest stage companies. And so you might really need to look much later stages that are ready to engage in a more concrete way with you.
Yeah, and I think with regards to non-digital types of POCs, sometimes this will definitely come in the upfront scoping. So there's, as we showed the journey of POC to prototype to pilot to full production, certain industries, the line between a POC and a pilot, like sometimes you can't actually test in a very contained way. You actually have to test with real consumers. And so it really comes down to drawing those boundaries in the POC, and making sure your end goal is what your stakeholders need to prove that the thing that you're trying to bring into the organization is actually working and is going to serve your end customer. So I think some of these industries are going to be a little bit more challenging if you have something like biotech and deep tech, but it really will depend on your upfront kind of alignment with the key people corporate. You ultimately need to engage and figure out what's the scope of this. And maybe a POC and the traditional definition isn't the right one.
Great. So this is a question that I actually think a lot of CVCs struggle with and corporate innovation strategists. So how do you get problem definition aligned with management buy-in? So if your problem definition is less metric, maybe more anecdotal.
So I'll start this off. I think sometimes with top management buy-in, a lot of this will come in setting the initial strategy for how you engage with startups and making sure that ties in with what management cares about and perhaps the latest corporate strategy or management priorities for the year or for the near term. And so, a lot of what our team actually does is setting the and making sure that management at least agrees with how they want to engage with the startups to begin with. And that way, when you actually get to the POC stage, they already have sort of a sight line into what's next and how that journey looks with the startup. I would say when you get to the POC stage, we usually have some sort of activation type of milestone meeting or workshop where we bring in the stakeholders and sponsors we feel are going to be needed to champion this effort. And we set out kind of a very distinctive milestone moment. Our team will engage them and figure out get realigned on the goals that we're all after and make sure the management and the same senior level sponsors are still engaged with what we're trying to do and on board with the pacing and progression of how things are going. So again, this will definitely depend on how many stakeholders are involved and how many senior level stakeholders need to get bought in. But we typically recommend, from the get-go of when you kick off startup engagement, make sure you have that management buy-in at that point. And then once you are at the POC point, have another checkpoint with the right executive sponsors to make sure they're still tracking with what you're doing.
I might add that if there's really a lack of metrics, framing things around the opportunity at hand, like getting a little more strategic, gets people out of that kind of fearful, like where are all the ways that this can go wrong mindset, and get people focusing on how this particular engagement can move things forward in a really big way. And so that can be useful for getting people kind of into a different mindset together.
Great. Now this one is kind of a logistics question. And I think 500 is well situated to answer. So basically it's very difficult and problematic to do a successful POC when corporate and startups are in different geographies, countries, locations, especially if the products are not SaaS. So are there any best practices on doing POCs whenever there's a huge geographic dispersion?
Are there? Okay.
So I think to kick it off, as Roland mentioned, for the way we want, like the best POCs are when you've broken off like the smallest possible chunk of what you're trying to test and keeping it pretty contained. And so I think if you have a product or offering that is going to naturally span multiple geographies, I think in that scoping process to see how confined can you make that, and can you start small and potentially think about how that might scale if something is tested effectively in that initial scope. But
yeah, I mean, and if you are perhaps dealing with startups in, like, taking that question another way, if you're a corporate that's working with startups that are in a bunch of different geographies, you might be able to avoid, I mean, it's always best to do things in person if you can, but you might be able to do a simple claims test that, shows that things don't work. I mean, this is before even doing a larger engagement. If you can do that, it's always going to be in everyone's best interest. It's going to save a lot of money, save a lot of time. But it's not impossible in this day and age to do things remotely with regular check-ins, making sure that you're project managing things and keeping people in touch on video.
What we've also seen a number of companies do is organize a kind of convening moment, though, where they can bring startups from around the world because they have something to offer. And that needs to be very clearly defined, and your value proposition is something you'll want to hone. So maybe it is, how do we help you break into this market? Or, can you give tips to startups at a certain stage about what it means to be risk compliant or something to that effect, working with a large financial institution? And so those are opportunities to convene, educate, give first, but importantly, use it as a moment to evaluate stage gate or whatever where depending on where you are with the startups that are going through your POC process.
All right, we have a ton of questions and we are running out of time, so I'll probably ask one more and then we will email responses to the rest of the questions and make sure everyone gets a response. So this question actually, it kind of is coming from several folks. Essentially, best practices for startups actually to approach POCs and corporates. So how do they find the right partner from that perspective? And I think it's important for even corporates to understand that response.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I mean, from a startup perspective, because they are operating on that tight timeline, they really need to weigh. They're going to be looking at the corporate for how fast can we get to some sort of commercialization, or can we do a quick test to understand, is this going to be like a corporate partner that wants to like work alongside us and help us achieve kind of our mission? Can we engage with them and figure out that they're going to do that quickly, right? Are they going to be a partner? Do they want to help us? Do they want to kind of give us something concrete at each stage? Or are they just, using us as corporate research, right? And we're not going to get anything out of it. So, on the startup side, I'm always kind of advising companies to look for those things. Like, you can't do stuff, for free forever, or your company will die. And so you need to quickly evaluate all of those opportunities in front of you and make sure that you're going to either get concrete knowledge as quickly as possible or get, a real commercial outcome.
All right. Well, that is unfortunately all the time that we have. Again, if you did ask a question, actually several of these questions will be addressed in our VC New York program. And we did do a lot of research into creating the content for that program based on common questions and frequently asked questions we get from corporates. But we will try to answer those specifically through email, and that will include a link to a recording of this webinar. So just a final reminder, applications for our Venture Capital Unlocked New York City program in partnership with Columbia's venture community. They're due tomorrow, and you can check out our website, ecosystems.500.co/New York, and or email me at vcunlocked@500startups.com. Again, my name is Patrick Driscoll. And the dates for the program are March 19th and 20th in New York on Columbia's beautiful campus, and there are only a few spots left. So we expect spaces to fill up quickly, so apply today. And a special thanks to Jenny, Roland, and BJ for their time today with the webinar, and any final thoughts or words from your team.
This is Vijay. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time. Really great to talk about something that is perplexing, vexing, but so important for startups to engage with corporates. If you're interested in talking about this and more, in particular, how to roll up your sleeves and also invest in startups, please join us at VC Unlocked in New York.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your week. Goodbye.